2023 was supposed to be the year when the electric car made its breakthrough to mainstream buyers and finally became cost competitive with combustion engine models. But it hasn't worked out that way. Well, to find out why, Gregor Sebastian joins me now for a closer look. He's a senior analyst at Rhodium Group. Gregor, good to talk with you as always. This wasn't the breakthrough year for EVs that many had hoped for. Why is that?
No, it wasn't a breakthrough year. We haven't, overtaken ICE sales in any of the major markets. But to be frank, it also hasn't been a catastrophic year. We've seen EV growth in all the major markets. And I think the reason why we are not quite at that break-even point is related to the battery production, right? At the moment, the battery production is still very much concentrated on a handful of players, all located in East Asia. And I think when we're going to really see the breakthrough is maybe in 2 to 3 years, when all the battery plants, which is really the main ingredient of electric vehicles, are coming online, are starting production in markets like North America and Europe.
A Reuters story today says that the average retail price of an EV in Europe was more than 65,000 euros in the first half of 23, compared with just over 31,000 euros in China during the same period. That's more than twice as much for the average EV in Europe as in China. Can that really be just the battery, or are there other things going on there in terms of unfair production practices, batteries, a lot of attention right now on China?
Yeah, I think here we need to be careful what we compare. Do we compare like for like or not? And in China, we currently have a massive price war going on where different car companies, both Chinese but also foreign ones like Volkswagen, have entered a race to the bottom, where basically most car makers are currently loss-making and are trying to increase their market share at the cost of, their bottom line. In Europe, I think it's a very different picture, right? Because as you mentioned in the beginning, ICE sales are still very strong. We still have EV purchasing subsidies, which are not there in the China market. So I think producers have a different logic here. It's not so much about being, the first one to have a 10-15% market share in the EV segment, but it's rather increasing the profit margin in this segment. And this is, I think, one of the major reasons why there's such a massive price difference. On top of that, obviously, you have a huge differential in production costs.
You mentioned those subsidy programs. We know that in some of these major markets, let's look at the US and Germany, for example, that these programs are either more limited than they were supposed to be, in the US, for example, or they're going to run out early, which has been recently announced in Germany. That also can't be good for electric vehicle take-up, I would imagine.
No, definitely. I mean, in the US market, we still face a lot of uncertainty about which models will actually be eligible for purchasing subsidies, even coming into the next year, right, when purchasing subsidies are made to be available to producers and then also consumers. We still don't know, for instance, whether Chinese private battery companies and their suppliers are going to allow OEMs based in the US to hand over those subsidies to the consumers. There's still a lot of uncertainty in the air. And in Germany, politics has kind of caught up with the EV revolution, or maybe more an evolution at this point, because of a budget crisis, which has meant that the government has chopped EV purchasing subsidies very abruptly.
You talked about this price war going on in China, how it's sending a lot of these Chinese auto producers elsewhere in the world looking for buyers. We see that in France, they've tweaked subsidies now to exclude most Chinese car makers. They have a system based on the carbon footprint of production. Could this hinder the necessary competition, or is it possible this is the only way for some of these models to feel competitive with these Chinese models that are entering the market?
Well, a bit of both. I mean, it's definitely going to reduce competition from Chinese EV makers. I mean, the rules don't specifically mention China because within the EU market, right, you don't want to discriminate against any specific country. This is very different from the US model, which is, naming specific jurisdictions, including China or Russia, as, potential governments that subsidize their producers. This is different in Europe and in France, but the rules were designed basically to exclude producers in China, not just Chinese producers, right? Also the Tesla Model 3, which is produced in the Shanghai factory, is not on the list of eligible models. And what that means for France is that, yes, consumers will probably face higher prices for products made in China. It also might mean that, European producers or producers that are producing in Europe might have a way to claw back some of the market shares that have been lost to Chinese vehicles. In the long term, it might also mean that you have companies like BYD and MG setting up production plants closer to Europe or even within Europe to once again become eligible for these subsidies.
You and I have talked about this before. There are also European car makers, and Tesla, of course, making these electric vehicles in China and then potentially importing them back into either Europe or the US. What's the future of that look like when we look at 2024? That seems like that would also be very much a political issue.
Definitely. And I mean, we have a probe by the EU Commission going on into subsidies handed out to producers in China for electric vehicles. And that probe is also very likely to affect foreign producers producing in China for exports. So that could mean that, car makers like BMW, Tesla, Renault, which are currently producing for the European market in China, will also face tariffs going future if this probe is concluding that there is high subsidization. It also means that car makers that are currently planning to use China as this emerging export hub because of the low production costs, because of the proximity to battery producers, and also because of a helpful hand from the Chinese government, they might rethink their plans. But it's still very much in the early phases of this EV probe, and next year we'll probably know more.
Gregor, you've touched on this, but are these Chinese brands really the juggernauts that they're being made out to be when we look at the years ahead? When we look at 2024, we talk about BYD, we talk about perhaps NIO, all these brands that have been really sort of clawing for market share in China, now heading towards Europe, towards elsewhere. What is their situation? How stable, how solid are these companies?
I think, looking at the Chinese market, you can definitely see that the indigenous brands, the Chinese brands, have a lot of success, right? And this is the most competitive EV market in the world. Consumers are really adopting EVs as the kind of new product, not just because of, its low carbon footprint, but also because of the new digital features that are integrated into these vehicles. Looking overseas, though, it's perhaps not quite the same story, right? BYD is facing quite a few headwinds in several markets. Most known, obviously, the US for political reasons, but also in other markets, right? The EV transition is just going to take time, and it's going to take a lot of investment also by these Chinese companies to, bring the charging infrastructure into third markets, into emerging regions like Brazil, but also Southeast Asia. And this high capital intensity also means that some companies might actually take on too much and overinvest, and then they will face too high debts that they cannot repay. And I mean, we're seeing that for a couple of the Chinese EV brands that have gone bankrupt in recent years.
We've also seen this year there's been a greater take-up of hybrid vehicles. Are they the big winner in this kind of delay in the take-up of EVs?
Certainly. I mean, we've seen a lot of growth, especially in the Chinese market, for these plug-in hybrid EVs. I think a lot of it also comes down to smart corporate strategies. There's two companies in particular that have done really well. One is BYD, which we already talked about. The other one is Li Auto, which is one of the kind of newer companies on the Chinese market. And they're really trying to compete not just with the mass volume brands of General Motors, Ford, or Volkswagen. They're trying to enter the luxury segment, trying to compete with Mercedes-Benz or BMW. And because of still ongoing rage anxiety by consumers, they have really bet heavily on the plug-in hybrid technology, and it's paying off well for them. So this is still a segment that we need to continue to watch.
All right, that's Gregor Sebastian with the Rhodium Group. Thank you very much.
Thank you.